Okay, so you guys have been asking some good questions in the comment section. I thought I'd take a moment to elaborate on some of them and give you some better and longer answers on a few of them, because a few of you might find these useful. The first question was about the Canon 35mm 1.4, the Mark I version. And the question is, it's so soft at 1.4, how do you get your pictures to look so sharp at 1.4? There's a couple of things. The first one is you have to have a fast shutter speed. If your shutter speed starts to drop even a bit, you got to think, with a 1.4, there's only a little bit of the picture in focus. If that has motion blur as well, even if it's fractional, it's going to look soft. You want to keep your shutter speed ideally above 160th of a second. That will help you freeze the motion in your pictures. The other thing is the gap between focusing and taking the picture. You can feel the autofocus motor moving, and you kind of need to feel that. You can sort of sense when the camera's getting it right and when it's stuttering and trying to find focus. Feel it with your hands. You can kind of tell when the lens is struggling and when it's not. When you know it's not, you know it's good to go and you're going to get some sharp shots. It doesn't matter whether you're using back button focus or front button focus. I mostly use front button focus, and I keep the focus point on the subject if they're moving at all. And especially with wide apertures, I tend to not focus and recompose. I tend to just leave it there, and then I'll crop the image a bit in post, because your depth of field again is so small that when you move that camera, if you focus and recompose at 1.4, it's probably going to be off slightly. So those are the two things. It's the focus, get that kind of, try and get that as accurate as possible by making sure that the gap between focusing and taking the picture is as short as possible, but also keeping your shutter speed high enough as well. And that means you're more likely to get a sharp picture. Okay, the next question. Hi Martin, full frame is only 35mm wide. We had this on film 50 years ago. A pro wedding photographer would have considered it too small. Are digital images better than 35mm film images? Maybe my question is too simplistic. Look, I haven't compared 35mm film because I've never shot film before. I only ever shot digital. But I'm guessing that it probably is better on digital, especially nowadays. But what I can tell you for definite is that full frame sensors on digital, weddings are easy for them. As long as you select your lenses. I mean, almost most of anything sort of made in the last 15, 20 years for a sort of a full frame sensor, most of it's really good glass regardless. So yeah, full frame for weddings is not a problem. So whether it digital or film, I imagine that digital's probably technically better than film was back then, but I really don't know. Actually, if you know the answer to that, drop it in the comments, because it's kind of made me think a little bit. I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't know, did people shoot weddings on 35mm film? Who knows? You guys probably know that better than I do, so drop a comment. This question is kind of interesting. This is about the Canon RP versus the A7 Mark I. I've owned both these cameras, so I can actually answer this. I need your advice. RP and A7 I. They seem to be very similar in terms of specs. That's fascinating. Like they're so, and you're right, they probably are similar in terms of specs. They're wildly different though. They've got nothing in common with each other. You see how different reality is versus what's on the spec sheets. From your real world experience, which would you recommend? Even the batteries are awfully similar. Yeah, awfully being the right word. Thanks in advance. I want to buy one of these. Look, the RP as an all-rounder camera is easily the better camera. The A7 can kind of beat the RP for static landscape tripod work. It's better for that. But I'd probably go for the A7R. Like, kind of why not at that point? It doesn't really matter. But the RP has good focusing. It's got, eye tracking, decent focusing. It's got better screen on it. It just kind of, it feels much more modern. It's more up to date. Despite the specs maybe looking similar, they're completely different cameras. For instance, if you do anything with portraits and people that are moving, the A7 is going to make you cry. You can work with that focusing system. I don't know why anyone would want to. If the other option is the RP, I would take the RP all day long. The A7 beats the Canon RP for dynamic range, but if you're prepared to do handheld bracketing of your exposures, or if you're prepared to use a tripod to bracket your exposures, you don't have to worry about that. there aren't really any circumstances for me, for what I shoot, where I would pick the A7 over the Canon RP. The Canon RP is just a much nicer camera to live with. This is about portrait photography, and I made this video about getting started in portrait photography, and this is quite a good question. I probably should have covered this in the video. Just a question, where do you suggest taking photos at the beginning? Studios are expensive and my apartment isn't often the right place. Now I get that, sort of inviting people back to your apartment isn't necessarily the easiest thing. So what I would do is, and what I would still do now even, you do not need a photography studio. You just need a space, right? If you buy your own backdrop system, you can buy something really basic like, I think Cake Backdrop do these pop-up, don't they? These circular pop-up backdrops with textures and things. Get something like that, or get a narrow roll of paper and a simple backdrop system. And you just go for studio or halls that are available in your area. So maybe churches have a spare hall. Maybe there's a yoga studio, something like that, where you can go and ask them if you can use it for about 2 hours. And that's what I do with my shoots. I don't like my shoots to drag on, because if the shoot goes on too long, the energy levels dip. My energy levels dip. I usually book for 4, but like 2 is enough to get the job done, especially if you don't need lots of different outfit changes and blah, blah, blah. And if you ask them to do their makeup and things in advance, just keep things simple and get things done, because imagine sort of you're going to take some time to set up, but a solid hour of shooting with a model, you're going to take a lot of pictures in that time. Don't do too many outfit changes. Don't trust them. Just try to get lots of different expressions and lots of different looks and things. Maybe to concentrate more on different lighting setups than outfit changes. That's probably better. And then kind of do that again. But if you can book for longer, for 4 hours, then go for it. But those church halls, or halls there's lots of buildings that have rooms for rent, and you can get into those spaces and just ask around and see how much things are, and you can usually get good deals. You do not need a photography studio. You only need a photography studio when you actually need all the gear that comes with it. And for what you're doing for portrait photography, you don't need that. That's more for commercial and so on. In that same video, I was talking about starting with a speed light and how you can just get going with just a speed light. You don't need to get like fancy studio lights. One speed light's enough to start with. And people make pictures, says, why don't we just call it flash? It's kind of like there's strobes and there's speed lights. Strobes are plugged into the wall usually, and they sort of power up and they're more powerful. Speed light is the kind of thing you can mount on top of a camera. So a strobe is a flash, a speed light is a flash, but a strobe isn't a speed light. Does that make sense? They're different. So when I say using a speed light, I'm specifically meaning that, because I'm not talking about using a strobe. This is a question that if you shoot Nikon DSLR, this will come up for you at some point if you go for a 50mm prime lens. So Martin, for the D750, which 50mm lens would you recommend from another manufacturer? I tried using the Nikon 50mm 1.8G, returned it inconsistent focus. Okay, so I've got quite a bit of extensive experience with the Nikon 50mm primes. And the thing of it is this, is the 50mm 1.8G has focus problems. I've owned about 5 of them, and every single one had focus problems. The 50mm 1.8D is screw drive, and that puts people off sometimes. Although it's actually a good lens, but it flares a lot. I would pull that lens out of the bag when I want a picture with a lot of flare in it. So you'd use it to that advantage. So the 1.8D is that lens with flare and lower contrast, and it's a nice look in itself. But the lens I would recommend isn't actually a third-party one. It's the 1.4G. It's really small, it's lower contrast and it's softer, but if you're using it for portraits, I think it's actually a fantastic portrait lens. And if you put the kind of performance to price to size to weight ratio thing together, it's probably one of the best 50mm available, because I kind of, in some ways, prefer it to the new 50mm 1.2 S or Z or whatever you call it. I think the 1.4G is, it's not technically as perfect, and I kind of like that about prime lens. I want it to have those kind of imperfections and inconsistencies. I actually really rate the 1.4G. You just need to know it's going to be lower contrast and it's going to be softer, but it actually looks nice. It vignettes quite a lot wide open. I think it's great. I actually really like that lens. I highly recommend it. Get that. And I've not had focus issues. I've used it a lot on the D600. no focus problems. Even at 1.4, out of focus points, just nails it, no problem. So go for that. And about the Canon 16 Mark 1, what about video? Is the autofocus good for that? No, it's not. It's really not. I get quite a lot of questions from people about like the 5D Mark 1 and the 6D Mark 1, asking me about what the video is like on it. People will say to me things like, is the 5D Classic good for video? It's like, it doesn't shoot video. And the 6D Mark 1 as well, what's the focus like? This question has come up a few times before. Is the focus good for video? No, it doesn't really focus in video. You can just forget that. It's manual focus. You can actually get some kind of reasonable looking video footage out of the Canon 6D, especially if it's just like a sometimes thing for you. But you will be using manual focus to do it, but it's actually kind of, reasonably competent. Colors are gorgeous out of it for video. It looks really nice, but it's not going to hold up to what the mirrorless cameras are doing nowadays. So if you want to get something for video, I would just get something that's separate and keep the 6D for stills. Anyway, that's all for today. See you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.